Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are joining us for our webinar on a new ITIF report called Mind the Gap, a design for a new energy technology commercialization foundation. Thanks for joining us. My name is David Hart. I'm a senior fellow here at ITIF and a professor at George Mason, as well as the co-author of this report, and I'm going to moderate today's session. Next slide, please. Let me just say a word about ITIF, which is the publisher of the report and houses the Clean Energy Innovation Policy Program, where this activity is coming from. It's a broad issue science and technology policy think tank based here in Washington, D.C., a non-governmental research organization. We would welcome your questions. You can find a link to offer questions through the Slido page underneath the live stream on the website if you're watching through that, as well as through a link under the YouTube page if you're watching on YouTube. Next slide. So let me introduce the panel. We've got an excellent group of speakers today. Leading off is going to be Jetta Wong, who is the main presenter and co-author on this report and really the lead architect and visionary of this project. She's a senior fellow at ITIF and a consultant with a variety of energy innovation organizations. And before that, served in the government, including as the founding director of the DOE Office of Technology Transitions, and has some experience on Capitol Hill as well. So Jetta will share the main ideas in our report. We certainly invite you to download the report from the ITIF website and send us your thoughts as well. So following Jetta, we have three commenters, starting with Paul Zielinski. He serves in a government-wide role as the executive director of the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer. Before that, he led tech transfer at the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. And he served in a number of different science and technology policy positions across the federal government. The second speaker on the panel will be Jennifer States. So she comes to us with two hats on. First, she's the director for the Blue Economy for DNV-GL, Energy and Maritime North America. That's a large logistics company, I think it's fair to say, among other things. She's also the project director for the Washington State Maritime Blue, and she's us from Seattle. So good morning to Jennifer. And she works on a wide variety of topics related to sustainable maritime innovation. And then hitting cleanup, or as we like to say here in Washington, in the Howie Kendrick spot, batting fifth. So Howie will live on forever in DC myth. Adam Cohen, he's the president and CEO of Associated Universities. Before taking on the leadership of AUI, he worked in a number of different roles at DOE and the national labs, including as Deputy Undersecretary for Science and Innovation. And with that, as I said, please offer questions through our website or through the Slido link on YouTube. And I'm going to turn it over to Jetta to share the main ideas in our report.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David, for the introduction. And thank you for being such a great partner in this whole process. I am very excited to tell everyone about an energy commercialization foundation. And you can see we have a lot to get through here in our table of contents, so I'm going to jump right in. So the first thing was that when we looked at this Department of Energy Foundation, we weren't really sure what it would do. So our goals for the project were to understand the value of a Department of Energy Foundation. And if we thought that there was something that it could contribute to the DOE stakeholders and to the energy innovation ecosystem, we would create a vision around that concept for this potential organization. We examined 9 congressionally authorized foundations that are set up in a similar way that this Department of Energy Foundation would be established. And then we interviewed over 140 individuals in the DOE world to understand what their needs and pain points were in the commercialization of technology. We put all of that together into 2 workshops where we vetted the concept and really learned that we needed to base these ideas on those existing agency-related foundations. So I'm going to briefly talk about these congressionally authorized foundations. They're all very different, but what makes them special is that they have this authorization to work in collaboration and coordination with their agency. Many of them create public-private partnerships, something like what you see here on the slide, the Biomarkers Consortium. We learned when we examined this foundation, this Biomarkers Consortium, that it's run by the Foundation for the National Institutes for Health, as well as several private sector companies and NIH, as well as other federal regulatory agencies. What this foundation does through this consortium is it brings together the different players and they create mutually beneficial R&D projects where they share the costs, results, risks into creating new diseases, new medicines and therapies for diseases. Another foundation that some of you may have heard of more recently is the Center for Disease Control Foundation, which has raised over $78 million for communities and hospitals where they're supplying them resources and equipment to fight COVID-19. So what makes these foundations special is their congressional authorization, which makes them an official organization of these federal agencies. And that gives donors a level of comfort when they're donating to these foundations because they know that they're donating on behalf of the public good because they're connected to a federal mission. And that was something that we heard was very important to many donors. So we put all this together and created what we're calling an Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation, which would have a mission to strengthen US competitiveness in a carbon-constrained world with a goal of accelerating the commercialization of new energy technology. And it would do this through re-granting funding to innovation organizations like labs and universities and incubators across the country that are working on collaboration strategies, just like what we learned from the existing precedents, to commercialize new technology. What's really important are these collaboration strategies, because what we heard from the stakeholders is that there is a problem in the energy innovation cycle. And in fact, most of us know this problem as the Valley of Death, and that on one side of the Valley of Death, you have early stage R&D that's funded by the Department of Energy, that's really focused on basic science and discovery activities. On the other side of the Valley of Death, you have the private sector. And the private sector isn't interested in commercializing early stage R&D. They are not interested in taking on additional risk. And so what we heard from our stakeholders is that we have these two sides, and it creates fragmented information in the innovation process, which creates market inefficiencies, slowing down commercialization. The way that the Energy Futures Initiative report from last year puts it is that success in crossing the Valley of Death requires the alignment of many players who bring different skills, experiences, knowledge, and resources to the innovation process. And so many of you are probably like, all right, Jetta, we know about the Valley of Death. What's going to make this ETCF unique? And what makes it unique, and what we learned from the other agency-affiliated foundations, is that they have a congressional authorization to work in collaboration and coordination with their agency. So in this case, the US Department of Energy. DOE is the largest funder of energy technology in the country. It is more connected to the private sector, to laboratories, universities, scientists, engineers, incubators that are working in the energy space than any other entity in the United States. It has a network of expertise. The thing is, and what you already heard, is that the Department of Energy mostly focuses on that early stage basic science area. And what would make the ETCF unique is that its sole responsibility would be to commercialize new technology. But it would be able to do this through its congressional authorization to leverage that technical expertise and that network of the Department of Energy. So as a foundation, the other thing that makes it unique is that it is a foundation, and most other foundations do not focus on bridging the Valley of Death, especially in the energy space. Many foundations focus on bringing more resources to the early stage basic science discovery activities, And then we have a growing number of foundations that are focused on combating global climate change, developing policies and regulations that, yes, help pull technologies into the market, but what these foundations are not doing, they're not supporting the scientists and the entrepreneur through the valley of death. They're not providing them the resources to develop and iterate on their prototypes, to connect to customers, and to potentially do demos. These are very important resources for making it through the valley of death. And so some people might say, why isn't the federal government funding this? And I agree. I think, yes, the Department of Energy should fund more of these activities. But we already heard that it's not just about funding. What this PCAST quote tells you is that the government is really good at invention, but when it comes to the later stage activities of the innovation process, the private sector actually needs to be engaged. They're the ones making the decisions around what technologies need to make it into the market. And so as we heard from our stakeholders, they wanted to see, and they want to see, reforms in the Department of Energy to bring the two sides of the valley of death together. And I would argue the DOE has actually been going through a process of reform. And in fact, they've been helped by Congress quite a bit. In 2005, Congress created the Technology Commercialization Fund. In 2007, they created ARPA-E. The department has launched Energy Frontier Research Centers, innovation hubs, and most recently, the Office of Technology Transitions, of course, something that's very dear to my heart. But all of these innovations in the R&D structure of the Department of Energy are within the Department of Energy. And what we learned from our research is that many federal agencies are constrained by general management policies that really reduce the ability for the foundation, for the federal government to be flexible. And over 200 times, Congress has acted to create organizations that overcome a variety of these constraints. From my personal experience at the Department of Energy, I know how complicated it is to create new contract mechanisms or to try to host public meetings or to do something that's slightly more innovative and outside of the box or outside of the budget line of a particular technology area. These things do impair the Department of Energy's ability to act fast. And so the ETCF will be able to move faster than the Department of Energy, be more flexible than the Department of Energy, and engage and collaborate with the private sector because we need their skills to bring new technologies to the market. So they would do this, the ETCF would do this through what we're calling collaboration strategies. These strategies would align the right players around national and regional energy challenges. The objective of these kinds of strategies would to be create the feedback loops between the researchers that are creating the new technologies and the private sector, again, that's going to be deploying and commercializing those technologies. These kinds of collaborations would reduce perceived risk, inform researchers about the market, and inform the private sector about the new technology being developed at our national laboratories and our universities. The role of ETCF would be to catalyze and incubate these collaborations. So let's talk about one of the collaborations we're suggesting. We're suggesting that the ETCF focus on national cross-cutting technologies, things that the Department of Energy is not working on or has a difficult time focusing on because of the technology doesn't fit nicely into a single program office. The 20-year saga of the desalination activities at the Department of Energy display kind of how difficult it is for them to have a consistent activity in a particular cross-cutting space. I know this, again, from personal experience when I worked on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, where we were focusing on the energy-water nexus in 2009. At that time, there was no one home for this cross-cutting technology. And in fact, there were specific resources in multiple program offices and across other agencies. Additionally, Congress is the one that controls the purse strings, and they're responsive to external factors like drought. And that makes their funding potentially inconsistent. And when DOE has inconsistent funding, it's very difficult for them to develop long-term R&D strategies. But we know that it doesn't need to be like this. And in fact, we're working with the private sector around other cross-cutting technologies that could benefit from this kind of foundation. And you'll hear a little bit more about that from our panelist, Jennifer States, in just a few minutes. So another strategy is around regional energy innovation ecosystems. We know from the great work that Brookings Institute has done to develop maps like this that show the energy innovation clusters around the country, as well as the work of the Energy Futures Initiative, the regional energy innovation ecosystems have their own energy challenges, their own energy regulatory structures, their own innovation resources. But we also know that not all regions of our country are created equally, and not all regions have the right resources to really bring technologies to the market. And so the ETCF's role would be to connect these regions to the technical expertise at the Department of Energy, also to help share best practices where one region of the country might be working on the development of electric vehicles and might not know what another part of the country is working on in the same space around electric vehicles, really bringing a national level understanding what's going on across the country to those different regions. So the ETCF would do this through what we're calling commercialization activities. These commercialization activities would be deployed into the collaboration strategies. Because right now, we know that technologies make it through the valley of death by serendipity most of the time. If you're a technology company, you will be lucky if you jump from one DOE program to get some investment from an investor to potentially to a CEC program, a California Energy Commission program, never knowing if you're actually going to make it out of the valley of the death, never knowing if you're going to have enough funding to make it to the end of the year. You're very lucky if you're able to connect all of those different programs together. The ETCF will help organizations across the country bring these commercialization strategies into bring these commercialization activities into the different kinds of collaborations, making sure they have the right resources, training, and connections at the right time. But the ETCF can't do this alone. And in fact, it needs Congress to act to actually set up an ETCF with the proper connection back to the Department of Energy. Congress needs to direct DOE to create guidance that would allow the ETCF to work in collaboration with DOE around funding, contracting, and collaboration, all the way from the secretary's level to the program office and then out to the national laboratories. What we also heard from the stakeholders is that it's very important that this foundation have that connection back to DOE, but that DOE should not have veto power over the activities of the foundation. So you'll hear more about these structures and governance models from a new report that will come out hopefully this year by the National Academy of Public Administration. Congress was wise in the last appropriations bill to direct the Department of Energy to commission a study around a nonprofit foundation like a DOE foundation to really focus on governance and structure. So expect to hear more about that very soon. For our part, ITIF is developing and planning on what would these national cross-cutting challenges potentially look like, with the opportunity to maybe work on the decarbonization of the marine transportation sector in the future. I hope that this report has piqued your interest around our Department of Energy Foundation, or an Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation. And with that, I will thank our 140 stakeholders, DOE, who helped us think through this process, as well as, of course, ITIF and David for being such a great partner. And with that, David, I am going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Jetta. That was a terrific presentation. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, the report is available on the ITIF website, and we welcome you to read it and send us your thoughts. So now we're going to move to our three panelists, and we're going to start with Paul Zielinski. Paul is the Executive Director of the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Tech Transfer. Paul, thanks for joining us.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone today about such an important topic. This idea of foundations is a real opportunity to bring together the amazing assets that make the US a leader in innovation and really are critical to our future development of technologies. You know, we have a very strong, proven mechanism of government-funded research and development across agencies. It's very mission-focused, it's put forth by government, as Jetta mentioned, for government purposes, and it achieves, the government purpose for the American people. But we also have a very unique American system of investment and entrepreneurship, and that brings ideas from the research programs into the marketplace. So, and this is really clearly outlined, as Jetta mentioned, in the ITIF report. And when I was over at NIST, as was mentioned, we put together a green paper called Unleashing American Innovation. And I had an opportunity to really explore this idea of foundations and what do foundations mean and how have they been used across the government. This idea isn't really exactly a new topic. We already have existing foundations for health. We have existing foundations for agriculture. In a lot of respects, it's actually almost amazing and incredible that we don't have a foundation for energy. As you think about it, energy is such an important and critical cornerstone to our whole economy. So what we really found in terms of foundations is this idea of integration across government mission with focused R&D efforts really is more effective. It really allows for this effective transition to the private sector, really focusing on industry-based development and industry focus. So this is one of these things, every day, if you think about it during this pandemic, we hear about all these folks talking about this idea of that, we need a new cure, we need new PPE equipment. You see this array of people talking about all sorts of different types of activities, and really what we're talking about is exactly this. We need to transition ideas from laboratories, be it a university laboratory, government laboratory, but from all of these great minds that we have working to the private sector, because they're the ones that are going to produce and distribute products. Now, while we really understand that during this current pandemic, this need never goes away. This is something that happens every day, and it's a continuing need for our country in order to stay competitive in the global marketplace. So when we look at this, from a government perspective, we're investing really about $150 billion every year in research and development. It's a big number. We spend a lot of money doing this research. But when you step back and think about it, the government doesn't make things. That's not the way our system works. So in order for these goods and services to eventually reach the American people to be of benefit, we need to really transfer it to a company. We need to work with a company. We have to get investment. The government can't fund every single product that comes out of the laboratory in order to reach the marketplace. And neither should we, because the private sector has proven much more accurate in terms of picking winners and losers. They're the ones that actually have that foresight and say, look, we think this can make it to the marketplace. We think this will be successful. So, as important as it is for the government to have an investment in research and development, it's still necessary to have private investment. It's not a one or the other kind of thing. It's really a both kind of a thing. We need both. They actually both fill a specific role in the whole economic ecosystem that's out there. And we really need to work together. And this whole fundamental basis of our foundations and this whole basis of how we do collaboration, this is what really all of the technology transfer legislation is about. If we step back and look at something like the Bayh-Dole Act, it's the same idea. It's how do you accelerate technologies to the marketplace? Really, how do you get the government out of the way? Don't give the technologies back to the government. Get them in the hands of the private investor. They can create a technology. They can make it available to the American people. There's lots of partnering mechanisms that are out there already. I assure you, I have personally signed thousands of them, at least well over 1,000 of them, if not several thousand of them myself. They're well used. They all fill a specific role. They don't do what foundations do because they don't provide funding. And that's something that's really different from a government perspective versus what a private industry perspective can be. When you look at the government, the government has to be very fair about everything. And you expect that. You should expect that as a citizen. We don't want to bypass making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to participate in government funding. And that's one of those things that's great, but it also removes the passion from the process. And so you take someone like, for example, some of our biggest innovators like a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs, let's face it, they were college dropouts. They're going to have a difficult time getting a federal award. But that's where the private sector can really step up and say, you know what, I see the vision. I get it. I see where these folks are going. We want to put some money on them. We're going to bet that that's going to be a successful product or service that people are going to want in the public space. Government doesn't do that. We try to make sure we're raising all ships. So foundations are a great bridging tool. They bridge this gap between government funding and economic growth. It's been shown to be a great way to launch new products and services, and it creates jobs. At the end of the day, that's really what we want to do, is create jobs and get these solutions out there. You know, it comes at a minimal cost for government. That's a great thing. It doesn't take away from the critical focus mission research that we're doing within the Department of Energy. It actually enhances it. It enables that research to reach the marketplace. And when it comes to American energy, this just absolutely makes sense to advance the technology, keep our nation competitive in the technology area for energy, and really uses our inherent advantage. This is something that really is a uniquely American experience in terms of how we invest, how we spin out new companies, and how those companies grow. And it's one of those things that actually, if you talk internationally, it's one of those things that this is where other countries are jealous of what we have in the United States. This is our secret sauce, and we really need to take advantage of that. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate that wide spectrum. And note to viewers, you can find the NIST green paper on the NIST website. It speaks to a wide array of policy issues related to technology transfer far beyond the foundation. Our next panelist is Jennifer States. She is joining us from Seattle, and she is with DNV GL. Jennifer, how's the weather out there on the West Coast?
Not raining too bad yet today, but we've had some sunshine. So thank you, Jetta, David, and the organizers and supporters of this event for giving me the opportunity to present today. As David mentioned earlier, I plan to wear two different hats. One is as Director for Blue Economy for DNV GL. I serve as a conduit within our globally diverse company for cross-cutting activities across energy and maritime sectors. DNV GL actually is a global advisory risk management company that also does third-party certification and classification of things like ships, started in the 1800s in Norway, actually. So the other hat I plan to wear is as project director for Washington Maritime Blue. This is a newly formed cluster organization that is working in collaboration across sectors and silos to implement maritime decarbonization and other joint innovation projects that are part of the state's strategy for the blue economy. We are facing an incredible opportunity and need to accelerate commercialization of difficult to decarbonize sectors, such as the maritime industry. The reductions in costs and weight for battery technology has provided an opening and uptake for electrification of ships, such as ferries, tugs, and offshore supply vessels. The growing regulations and demand for shore power as an alternative to diesel engines for ship hotel loads is providing opportunities for ports and utilities to work together to meet the needs of their customers. The electrification of cargo handling equipment and cargo transport vehicles, such as yard tractors, drayage trucks, and forklifts, provides additional loads for utilities, while energy demands are shrinking across many other sectors. And new international regulations for emission reduction from ship operations means that new technologies and alternative fuels must advance at a faster pace than they are right now in order to meet these forthcoming deadlines. But how do we meet these challenges and turn that into a competitive opportunity for our local industries? This is exactly the question that Washington Maritime Blue attempted to address in developing a state strategy for our blue economy. The strategy concluded with the launch of a cluster organization that was charged to work in collaboration across different public and private entities and across energy and maritime sectors in finding new ways to tap into different funding types in order to implement demonstration projects. It is also critical to work in collaborative planning efforts to develop roadmaps and share lessons learned in order to scale the new innovations. But a state-based effort can only do so much. So why do we support the idea of a DOE foundation? Because we know that a collaborative model that allows for cross-sector engagements can work, but we need to tap into a much broader pool of expertise, facilities, and funding in order to implement those innovations. For example, we are currently running what we call a joint innovation project to design and deploy a new foil ferry, a fast foil ferry that is made of carbon fiber, runs on batteries, improves vessel efficiency dramatically. But we really could use support in reducing the risk to maritime mammals and by the use of ocean observation systems, for example, for detection and avoidance. The expertise and equipment along these lines could be found at Pacific Northwest National Labs and our other labs and university partners from the Pacific Marine Energy Center. NOAA also has lab capabilities and funding in this space, but our team in Washington cannot develop such a system for this vessel only. It needs to be part of a broader effort, leveraging existing knowledge and capabilities. And this is the type of thing a DOE foundation could coordinate to tap into the cross-cutting approach that is needed. Speaking as a private industry representative, I have heard many frustrations expressed by my partner companies and colleagues in trying to do business with the federal government. Solicitations are typically organized by technology office, while many industry demonstrations that need to take an interconnected systems approach for the business case to succeed. The bureaucracy in applying for and dealing with federal opportunities is often described as not worth the cost of doing business. From hair splitting and designating eligible entities to the required time recording on an hourly basis to burdensome reporting requirements and changes in expectations from different staffs and offices, I often struggle to get colleagues to even respond to requests for information looking to shape funding opportunities directly related to their areas due to the perceived lack of return on time invested. So a new model is needed to bring industry to the table in a way that allows us to work together to accelerate the necessary innovations. I see the proposed Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation as an opportunity to accomplish just that. And the timing and need could not be more critical. Decarbonization of the maritime sector is being driven by increased global and regional regulations. But in Norway, I've seen the industry and government alike calling for even stricter regulations because they know they have made investments in new technologies in such a way to give them a competitive edge in global markets. If the US is to compete, we need to leverage our collective assets more effectively and target investments into meeting our cross-cutting decarbonization challenges. Well, thank you for your time and consideration, and I look forward to discussing these opportunities and addressing your questions.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. So at ITIF, our main objective is accelerating innovation and creating competitive opportunities. And I'm especially glad you mentioned the hard to decarbonize sector because that is the biggest challenge facing the US and the world. So our next and final panelist is Adam Cullen, the President and CEO of Associated Universities, Inc. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to Jetta and the organizers of this panel. You gave me 6 minutes to cover two things that each could likely fill multiple panels, so I'll try to summarize at a very high level and go very fast. Let me start with the valley of death that Jetta mentioned, because I think that's important to understand this gap between the lab R&D and commercialized products, or invention and diffusion, as Jetta showed on one of her slides. So I like to think of this as two parts. The first valley, or the first part of this valley, is formed from developing a lab scale innovation outward. And the second part is by the market reaching inward, in other words, looking for a solution or a breakthrough. This construct is helpful to perhaps identify issues to address for effective tech transfer. And to fully close this valley of death, you need to understand from both sides, this is just a model, or it's just a construct. But if I take this model, if I look at the second valley, this is the target of industry collaborators, venture capitalists, most other foundations, focus on trying to reach into the lab system. And I don't just mean the national labs, I mean, academic research, to try to pull technologies outward. But the first part of this valley is not as well covered. And this is something that this foundation can really help address. There is no consistent funding, for example, for accelerating innovations from, say, the lab breakthrough stage to the energy scale technology, so that it can be effectively evaluated by the marketplace for further scale up and deployment or diffusion. So why is this true? Certainly there are lots of reasons, but first is it's hard to fully evaluate something at the lab scale or the lab level because the risks for further development are high. And educated guesses at that level for what can be scaled up and diffused to fully meet a market need are harder to make. The second is there is a culture gap. So full disclosure, I'm an engineer, but I've conducted research and have spent much of my career helping bridge the gap between research and development. For example, working on big facilities, tech transfer, et cetera. And there are differences in the skills and thought processes on each side of this valley. So scientists, for example, and I'm summarizing and stereotyping a little bit, but scientists are interested in researching and helping answer interesting questions. Individual scientists may or may not be interested in pushing a discovery to the next steps because there may be no interesting problems to solve or questions to answer. And if the scientist is not interested in that, then you have a gap between the person who knows the discovery inside and out and those who might come with resources to pull the potential innovation forward. The third is, the development to demonstration is an interesting problem in and of itself, and that requires a unique skill set. So systems engineers, for example, thinking about materials decisions or manufacturing or distribution channels, that's a really interesting set of problems, and it's not necessarily covered by the existing system. So let me shift a little bit to DOE. Can DOE do this by itself? Perhaps, but it would take a large amount of effort. Interfaces, whether in materials or processes or organization, take energy to overcome. And there are several interfaces that would potentially inhibit this type of thing being implemented within DOE itself. Some of these were mentioned. DOE is a federal government agency that comes with all the bureaucratic and political overlays. But DOE is more than just any federal agency. It's a very complex one. The missions are critical and broad. So DOE, as I like to say, does weapons to watts to waste. So they have a very, very broad set of very high risk missions. For weapons, they own the full spectrum. DOE through NSA supports the basic research, manufacture, stewardship of the stockpile, non-proliferation, naval reactors. So they own that full cycle. Whereas in the watts area, or the energy area, they don't have that span. So they have to interface with lots of the players and stakeholders across that whole spectrum. DOE does the physical research. They are the largest funder of physical research in the country, and they connect with universities and other researchers on that side. So as a result, you have this natural interface between all these stakeholders trying to figure out how to move clean technology. This is something that this foundation could help bridge. DOE has interfaces within it, the stovepipes. They have one undersecretary that oversees fundamental science and a different one that oversees the applied work in nuclear, fossil, transportation, et cetera. And while in the best case, the current undersecretaries do try to work together, that's great, it's still an interface. So when I was in DOE, Ernie Moniz had combined these under one undersecretary, Lynn Orr. And while I happen to like that model, the reality is even under that model, we still had a difficult time bridging some of the interfaces between, say, the Office of Science, the Office of EERE. We tried to do this with various mechanisms, including Jetta's Tech Transfer Office, also doing things like cross-cut initiatives, but it's hard. It's hard to overcome these. And finally, DOE has the labs, and that construct, while great, it's a great system, performs fantastic research, runs world-class facilities, and provides a tremendous strength to the US. It does add additional interfaces, additional stovepipes exist within the lab itself. It is run by contractors, and so that too, through the contract, provides some restrictions. They are FFRDCs, or these federally funded research development centers. They're not supposed to compete with industry, so that itself causes some issue. And it's not even clear where that bright line is between competition and non-competition. So with that, I'll stop because I threw a lot out there, but it is a very complex situation that has multiple constraints. This foundation isn't necessarily the silver bullet, but it can help overcome some, if not many, of these constraints.
Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate that perspective. And I would just want to echo your last point. This is not the answer. There is no answer to the Valley of Death, the technology transfer challenge. We're going to need lots of different answers. And as Jetta mentioned, we see this foundation as one of a series of efforts that have taken several years, more than a decade, to build up, and that will certainly continue into the future. Jetta, I don't know if you want to react to that last comment of Adam's, how this interfaces with the existing DOE technology transfer programs, or take up any of the other threads that have been mentioned. And then for the audience, I've got a fantastic list of questions. you're certainly welcome to keep them coming, and I will do my best to sort through them as we wrap up with the next 20 minutes of Q&A. Jetta.
Yeah. Thank you, David, and thank you to all the panelists. It was great to hear your perspectives on the foundation. I think that the question around how does the Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation either interact or work with the existing, I think, tech to market activities at the Department of Energy. Well, first of all, it's great that those activities are going on, and I am proud to say that, you know, I was in charge of some of those, and I think that those need to continue because that is part of the reform that we've already seen take place at the Department of Energy and trying to break down those interfaces that Adam just discussed. The difference, though, is that all of those activities fall into very strict budget lines. And so, as Adam was just mentioning, many of the technology offices have to abide by congressional budget lines. So there's a solar office and there's a wind office, there's a fossil fuel office, and you can't innovate outside of those activities. So if you want to think about what Jennifer was talking about, some of the more systems-oriented innovations that are required in our very complex energy world, it's hard to do those kinds of activities. So one thing that the Energy Technology Commercialization Foundation would focus on are these more cross-cutting oriented challenges in the energy space.
Thanks. Paul, did you have a comment there?
Let me just throw in, you know, as I mentioned, there's many different mechanisms. They all have their place. They're all unique. I do think a lot of this comes down to money. One of the big things that you see in technology transfer partnering agreements is they're different than acquisitions, and they're purposely different from acquisitions, and they should be purposely different from acquisitions because they're much easier to do that way. But it doesn't allow necessarily for an easy follow-up. And so then you have to go back into a government acquisition process, and that's really very difficult, as opposed to pushing it out to industry, and a foundation can enable some of those things. So it's, as I said, it's not a matter of getting rid of any of those things. They all have an excellent purpose, and they are very well used by the Department of Energy. Actually does a great job in getting these things out there and used. But this is a little different. This is actually getting people to actively pay attention to what's coming out of the laboratory, as opposed to passively and trying to get over that hump. And that's really difficult to do sometimes.
So I think that sets up the next question well, which is why would companies want to work with an entity like an ETCF? And I guess another question asks about investors. Have investors expressed interest in this kind of concept? Jennifer, maybe you want to speak a little bit to that from your experience, and then I'll open it up to others.
Sure, yeah, of course. You know, I mentioned in my comments some of the reasons that we think a DOE foundation would be really useful. And of course, funding tops the list, but funding, access to facilities, and access to expertise that we can't necessarily tap into in the private sector is one of the key reasons. But I think the other is just having that collaborative environment where you can do these kinds of projects that are cross-cutting, that go into different silos across energy and maritime, different silos within Department of Energy. You know, for maritime decarbonization activities, it can cross the fuel cell technology office, sometimes solar and using solar on the shore side, to the batteries, to vehicle technologies, which I think should be vehicle and vessel technologies. There's no one entity within DOE or even outside of, when you talk about MARAD, Department of Transportation for maritime, there's no one entity that really is focused on helping decarbonize the maritime industry. So we have to have a place where we can all come together to solve the challenges and to have funding opportunities that are structured in such a way that work for private industry to be able to access and bring together their government partners in order to make it happen. We actually did a capital landscape study in Maritime Blue to look at where there is finance available, and it actually identified that one of the key gap areas is foundation funding. And the recommendation is we need to develop strategies to support increased investment in Washington's maritime economy, including philanthropic partners who can help lower or remove risk from investments. So being able to have the DOE Foundation where additional foundations can bring money, government can bring money, private sector can bring money together in those public-private partnerships to enable these demonstration projects, I think is really the key to helping move this forward on a national scale.
Thanks. I'm going to kick it to Jetta to talk to the investor interest question. But before I do that, let me just say, I think there are a lot of challenges like the Marine Decarbonization Challenge. And I would encourage people to look at my colleague Colin Cunliffe's report on the innovation agenda for deep decarbonization. There are a number of sectors all across heavy industry, the cement sector, the steel sector, as well as in various aspects of transportation beyond the marine, aviation, heavy trucking, and so on, where this kind of effort could be helpful. So when we think about cross-cutting challenges, those are the kinds of things we mean. And Jennifer did a great job of explaining the complexities of DOE, and all of these challenges, engage numerous units at DOE that do have a hard time working together. And while we're not going to do away with all of those challenges with the ETCF, it can, I hope, provide some kind of lubrication to help them work together. So Jetta, what about investor interest? So in talking to stakeholders, who's expressed interest in this concept?
So I think what's really important to think about when it comes to investors and investing in this early stage and kind of bridging the valley of death is that, yes, we did talk to investors and we talked to a variety of private sector companies. And what's important to remember is that many of these organizations have their own objectives that they're trying to achieve, right? The investors are looking for a return on investment. And when it comes to some of these energy technologies that take a much longer time to make it to commercialization, it's a hard thing for them to invest in unless they can reduce their risk. And that's one of the reasons why we really focused in on collaboration strategies, because we also know that the private sector itself has a lot of money that's sitting on the sideline. We always hear that there's private dollars, they're sitting on the sideline, not currently investing in the market in these new technologies. And so the point of the collaboration strategies are to bring those two sides of the valley of death together and making sure that the private sector would be even interested in investing and bringing those technologies to the market. And through the process and those feedback loops that we were discussing, they would be able to shape the development of those technologies into something that they would actually want to put their own money into. That's what's really important, is making sure that when we're developing the technologies, we're actually solving problems in the energy space. And the people and the organizations that are most familiar with that are those in the private sector, getting them to put their money into the valley of death because they see that the risk is reduced and the technology is going to solve their problem is part of the solution.
Jennifer, I think I saw you signal.
Yeah, just to add on to that, in our capital landscape study that we did on this, we found that few equity providers were focused on maritime and the energy decarbonization challenge that we're talking about here, either because they weren't knowledgeable of the challenge and what existed and the opportunities, or because of government regulations and concerns about scaling and exit potential. So, what we see is an opportunity, one, to raise awareness of the challenges and the investment opportunities, but two, we really need to find a way to de-risk and bring different funding together in that valley of death stage to get it to the point where private equity can move over and make these investments.
Adam, do you have a comment? We're getting a little bit of noise from your setup there too as well.
Oh, from me, sorry. So the only thing I was going to say is the most effective way to close the gap is from both sides, and you'd have to have private funding coming from the one side as well as the research innovations coming out from the other side. So this foundation is an effective bridge in some regards to do that.
Thanks. Let me just also mention that the biggest thing that we found in talking to investors and companies was they had never heard of the concept. So we certainly have an educational task ahead of us to let people know that these things exist. I would expect in the health world, people do know more about the NIH Foundation, the CDC Foundation, but I must say, coming into this topic, I hadn't really never heard of these kinds of quasi-governmental entities either. Paul, go ahead.
Well, so sort of building on what you already just addressed, just hoping and wishing that people are going to find all these innovations and bring, spend all their time examining the setup and the complexities of the department and then bringing them to market. That's not really a strategy compared to actually having a dedicated body that understands and can interact and then make that bridging effective in terms of bringing the private capital to the market or to bear on these technologies. I mean, I think that's really critical in these things, is actually doing it actively, because right now it's a lot of work to try to get people to find the technology, and you got to find the right company at the right time, ready to invest and able to do the tech, launch the product. That's difficult, and it really has always been one of the more difficult parts of technology transfer.
Jetta, another question that's come in, which we've talked about quite a bit as the project moved forward, is how this approach compares to having each lab have its own foundation. There are a couple of labs that have foundations that do activities that are something like what we've proposed. And so I wonder if you might speak to that question.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So first of all, when we examined the existing agency-affiliated foundations that are authorized by Congress, we learned that many of those foundations have partners that are on the ground that either work with other centers or institutes that are across the country, or in the case of the National Park Foundation, work with some of their park units across the country. Some people might be more familiar with those because they're the Friends of X Park examples. And what we found is that these national organizations are able to help and facilitate the activities of these organizations that are across the country, providing them either additional communication activities or leveraging the national platform that the national organizations have. So really bringing attention to local problems, helping the local foundations fundraise around their local problems, but at a national level. Another one of the precedents that we had seen is really trying to kind of provide some of the back-end services for some of the smaller foundations. So we learned from the Berkeley Laboratory Foundation, which is kind of sponsored by the University of California. The University of California actually provides a lot of the back-end activities for them. And I mean, like, they help them with the accounting, with the things that are office activities that a small foundation would have a very hard time setting up on their own. And so if there's a national foundation, you could see that national foundation doing similar activities for foundations across the country for all 17 national laboratories. Another thing that we know is that some of the DOE laboratories are small to begin with, and they might not be even interested in starting their own foundation. So having a national foundation that would be able to help them is also very important. And I can go on, but those are some of the reasons why a national foundation could work very collaboratively with the individual laboratory foundations.
Thanks. Another question that's come in has to do with protecting the interests of DOE and the taxpayers. So this foundation does raise potential challenges of conflict of interest, which we have seen with some of the other government agency-related foundations. And I thought, I don't know, Paul, whether you might want to chime in on this one.
Sure. So I think this is really the fundamental issue that comes up, and that is, what is the government's interest, right? So the government's interest is actually, from a laboratory perspective, is getting technology out there. I mean, you're doing the experiment, but like I said, you're not going to make the product. There is no government agency that's going to be manufacturing, advertising, distributing, producing these things and putting them in the hands of people. Even if you look at the defense folks, they buy things, they don't make things. I mean, that's just not the way our economy is built. So you need this bridge. You need something that's going to invest in developing the product, even to make it available for people to buy. And that is the mission of the research. It's not just to do some grand idea that's out there and then nothing happens. It's actually to make action. That's where these foundations are so critically important, because it's a matter of connecting it to money and creating products, services, jobs, all of these things that drive the economy.
Adam, I don't know if you're, go ahead, Jetta.
I would add another thing that when we were examining the existing agency-related foundations, kind of digging into how do they have these relationships with their agencies, I found that many federal agencies have internal guidance, very detailed guidance on how they are supposed to interact with their external foundation. And it lays out everything from how foundations can transfer funds to the federal government, how the individual employees can develop potential policies or potential projects that could be R&D activities that could go to the foundation where they could then identify funding opportunities. So making sure that the foundation has a strong relationship with its agency, but that's also very clearly outlined in these kinds of policy and guidance documents is going to be critical to the success of a foundation that's providing a public service, but not creating any kind of conflict of interest.
Great, thanks. So we have about 5 minutes to go, and I'm going to wrap up with 2 questions. One about how a foundation like this might play a role in an emergency situation. Hopefully we won't run into anything quite like what we're going through at the moment again, but there will be challenges that arise in the future. And then we'll wrap up with Jetta to talk a little bit about the next steps. But let me start with that. Jetta mentioned that both the CDC Foundation and the NIH Foundation have been able to mobilize quickly in the face of COVID, and obviously it's their mission that is implicated in this current challenge. But maybe you could speak a little bit, and others might chime in. How does the flexibility of an entity like an agency-related foundation help in a situation where you need fast action?
Sure, absolutely. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit, actually. You know, I live in Oakland, California, and some of you may have seen the news last year when the utility in Northern California was doing brownouts. So they were actually turning off the power to over 1 million people because they were very worried about wildfires. And at that time, there was a lot of interest in the communities in Northern California about, well, shouldn't we have new technology that's more resilient to wildfires? Shouldn't we have new technologies that can tell us and explain what's going to happen with these wildfires so we don't have these brownouts? I know several people that lost power. It's important and during these times that the foundation would be able to act and identify potential technologies and collaborations that could really serve the needs of these emergency situations. So one example that I know of, for example, is the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory has a computational technology, a technology that they're already using to understand the impact on the grid from things like hurricanes and cyber attacks. They could do something very similar as it relates to wildfires, but no one really is thinking about that now, right? We're not in the middle of fire season, no one's worried about the grid. But if there was a foundation, they could act immediately and say, all right, what technology do we need? Let's find some funders, let's find the right collaborative partners and figure out how to solve these problems. DOE can't act that fast, and maybe Adam wants to talk about that.
Yeah,
well,
ahead,
the only thing I was going to add is that if you think about the COVID situation, it's actually a pretty good example. Let's say we were to develop a vaccine tomorrow. You still have the problem of manufacture and distribution and scale. And it's not clear that a government agency can figure out how to pivot that quickly, although, you know, something like the DLA might be able to do some of that. But what do? They engage industry in a very quick, flexible way. This foundation, as you just pointed out, is supposed to or potentially could look at these problems from these different facets and help try to close those gaps and understand the full systems approach from very start fundamental research all the way through what does this look like when you actually have to deploy it out into the real world.
Thanks, Adam. Jennifer, a brief comment?
Yeah, we've actually seen this happen within Maritime Blue with COVID right now. We had a startup company called Discovery Health that was in our accelerator program and working to design virtual medical services for folks on ships. And talk about a confined space that needs to deal with infection in the right way. They had some procedures and guidelines, and we as well at DNVGL for cruise industry have some procedures on handling this. Well, suddenly they're launched to the national stage, but how do you get funding to these entities quickly in order to be able to deploy this in a broader scale? And what we're talking about is potentially doing that through a nonprofit collaborative cluster, which can bring some foundation funding because the private government funding couldn't happen fast enough through the bureaucratic procedures. So if we had a DOE foundation, we really could accomplish this on the national scale that's needed.
Thanks, Paul. I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to accommodate your comment right now. I'm just going to ask Jetta to say a word about what happens next, and then we'll close up.
Well, we're really excited to hear that the NAPA study is going to happen around governance and structure. We know that the Congress does have a bill, a bipartisan bicameral bill, to authorize a Department of Energy Foundation. And we're hoping that the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee will be able to work on that bill and pass it this year, because, as I said, we need to see a direct connection between a foundation and the Department of Energy to really leverage the capabilities of DOE. So you can't do that without that special congressional authorization. So we're excited to see that there might be some movement there.
Thank you. Thanks, Jetta, for sharing the report. Thanks to Jennifer, Paul, and Adam for joining us. Thanks to everybody who listened in and for all your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. I hope you'll find most of the answers in the report. And if you don't, shoot us a question or comment through ITIF. Thanks, and with that, we're going to conclude.